Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar. My name is Carl Brown. I'm the Assistant Editor of Building. This session today, sponsored by Rockwool, is all about retrofit, with a particular focus on a case study, Wilmcote House, an 11-storey residential development in Portsmouth, which was refurbished 3 years ago. And we're going to hear all about the lessons from that project while we all reflect and discuss the future of retrofit. We all know why this topic is important. The International Committee on Climate Change found that 17% of emissions in the UK are related to the heating of buildings. So retrofit and refurbishment have a huge role to play in tackling the climate crisis. Do pop your questions throughout this presentation in the chat box. I will be able to see these coming through, and I can put them to the panelists. And they are. There are two people involved in the Wilmcote House project, Adam Hardwick, who's the Building Project Manager at Portsmouth City Council, and James Traynor, the Managing Director of ECD Architects. I'm going to be quiet now for a bit and hand over to James and Adam, who will be speaking for around 30 minutes or so, which should leave us lots of time for your questions and debate towards the end. Adam and James, over to you.
Thanks, Carl. My name is James Traynor. As Carl mentioned, I'm Managing Director at ECD, and with me today is Adam Hardwick, Building Projects Manager for Portsmouth City Council. We are going to be talking really about Wilmcote House and the work that we did over the last few years and since completion a couple of years ago, and also speculating on the future of retrofit as well and capturing sort of lessons learned. I'm going to start off by introducing us, but then hand over to Adam to talk a bit about the history of Wilmcote House and the resident consultation process that they undertook. And then I'm going to talk about the standards that we targeted, which was the EnerPHit standard, what the challenges and benefits that brought, the completion and monitoring of the building post-completion, and any lessons learned and the future of retrofit. So. Without further ado, our client, Portsmouth, is City Council, obviously on the south coast, with approximately 15,000 properties, and of which Wilmcote is an important part of the mix, one of 13 high-rise buildings across the city, and they also control commercial assets as well. I'll skip through that. A little bit about ECD, just a snapshot of some completed schemes in recent years. Majority of our work is in housing, but also in other sectors as well, education, universities, etc. So skipping through that, I'll introduce the wider project team. So on the client side, we were working with our colleagues in Keegan's, and structural engineer as well, Carter Clark. We had a contractor in NG who had their own design team, Design Bureau and Gardner Stewart, and a research team, importantly, University of Southampton doing the monitoring, and London School of Economics doing resident interviews, funded by Rockwool. So just to set the scene really in terms of what's happening in the building sector and the need to achieve net zero carbon by 2050, you can see from that graph there, the orange part of the bar there is carbon emissions from buildings, where we were 2 years ago and where we need to get to. Sorry, my screen's gone a little bit funny, so I'm just going to shuffle things around. So there's a huge scale of the challenge. It's obviously enormous. And in the building sector, there's been very little improvement, certainly in the last 5 years. So there's really a big mountain to climb in terms of decarbonising our buildings. But most of our buildings, the vast majority of our buildings, will be here in 2050. 85% of all existing buildings, and a huge proportion of those will be housing. So we really need to tackle our existing housing. So I'm going to hand over now to Adam. So I'm going to control the slides for Adam. So you might hear Adam say, next slide, please. Adam, can you hear me?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, James. So yeah, just to give a little bit of context and background to the project in Wilmcote House itself. So the building is located in the Somerstown area, Portsmouth, in the city centre, and it's in one of the sort of most deprived areas of the city. There's obviously low income to property in families, and also high levels of fuel deprivation. In terms of the building itself, it's built in the late 1960s, 11-story block of flats. You can see on the sort of top left-hand picture there, it's 3 main blocks that are linked by stair and lift towers. It's important to note the construction type of the building is a REMA large panel system. So in its inherent nature, it's a concrete building, very poor levels of insulation, and also the structural constraints of the building due to the risk of disproportionate collapse, which meant that the only heating system that could go inside the properties was electric. So that was a fairly significant limitation. In terms of the actual, like the makeup of the sort of dwellings, at ground floor level there were 7 one-bedroom flats. We also had our old housing office was located at ground floor level in the building, and then at first floor and above there was 100 3-bedroom maisonettes. So they were all family dwellings, and they were, you know, generally they're quite large for the type of property they are. If you can move on. So this is just a general photo of the sort of northern side of the building. A much simpler elevation than you'll see on what we call the garden side, and this basically contained the majority of which was the bedrooms, and then on the other side you had the living accommodation and kitchens. So if you move on. This is just a general photo of the sort of estate. I think it's taken from around the 1970s. You can see Wilmcote House down the bottom there in the centre of the picture, and that gives, I've got some other photos later, but you can start to see on the sort of garden side, you've got open walkways, and that's how residents access the properties, and that created a significant challenge in terms of retrofitting the building. If you move on. So in terms of, like, you know, the driver for change and why we're looking at the building, it was in a really poor condition. You know, before we did the project, there was issues across it in terms of like maintenance and you know, the sort of social issues as well within the building. The chart there is fairly interesting. On the right hand side in the sort of dark solid bar, we did monitoring of a number of properties to sort of look at their sort of energy use and their heating use, to sort of establish, you know, how much were they using the heating, how much was it costing, etc. The solid dark bar shows the energy need to heat the property to World Health Organization levels, so that's the equivalent of 21 degrees. The bars on the left hand side show the results of the properties we monitored, and the key finding there was basically people weren't actually heating their properties sufficiently to achieve the 21 degrees level. So basically a lot of the properties were, you know, they couldn't afford to heat them to that level, so, you know, which resulted in obviously less energy usage. And I think that was an important finding, because when we started to look at the project in terms of like potential savings in terms of resident bills, it became apparent that we wouldn't achieve the same, you know, levels that we might think on paper in terms of cost saving, because they actually weren't heating the properties, you know, to the required level initially. And also, just to give a bit of context as well, if you take the sort of dotted line as about 21 degrees, we also found that a lot of the residents were living in properties where, you know, the temperatures were, you know, down to sort of like 11, 12 degrees internally within the properties, and obviously that didn't provide suitable accommodation, you know, and a good living environment really. If you move on. So again, before we started the project, you can see that there's obviously a list there of sort of issues that we were encountering. You know, a further properties suffered from condensation, mold growth. The windows were at the end of their life. The roof needed replacing. The day-to-day maintenance costs were increasing, and obviously, you know, we had the issues of the construction type, and also, you know, we could only use electric heating. So when we were looking at options to refurb, there wasn't really an easy or straightforward solution to try and tackle some of these issues. So We could have just done a traditional planned maintenance approach, change windows, put new roofs on, etc. But that wouldn't have addressed, the issues with the building fabric in terms of insulation, and we would have still remained, having issues such as condensation and a poor environment there. So really, it was, there's a lot of things that need to be considered to push us, more to a retrofit solution. James. So obviously, sort of a big consideration at the time was demolition. Again, in terms of a bit of further background, the whole of the Somerstown area was previously identified through a large-scale regeneration scheme, and Wilmcote House was in that with a view to demolishing the building and constructing new. When we got to sort of 2008, 2009, in the sort of economic climate at that time, the whole scheme fell over. It wasn't viable to sort of regenerate areas of that scale, so we had to look at other options. We did an appraisal of demolition and rebuild of just the block, and we estimated it'd be around £24 million to build back a similar sort of size development. That cost at the time, the funding wasn't available for that. But I think probably one of the bigger issues that led us away from demolition was about the practicalities involved in getting there. So, like I said, it's a large building, with 100 family properties. We didn't have a pipeline of properties available for them to move into, so that would have had a huge impact on our existing housing waiting list, and really sort of create a lot of problems for us. We anticipated it'd be around sort of 2 years to try and decant the building, and the knock-on effect, like I said, on the waiting list, and obviously over that time, we're losing rent at the same time, so the costs go up, and also potentially the area could deteriorate as well, having sort of empty properties as well. So from that, we sort of rejected the demolition option, and like I said previously, where there was so many issues with the building, we wanted to try and future-proof it, so that led us then more towards retaining the building and doing a whole building solution. James. So this is just a site plan, just to give a bit more context. So it shows you the three sort of blocks that they're linked by the stair towers. Adjacent to the stair towers, you've got sort of communal stalls for residents' possessions, etc. And we did have, you can see this little building that pops out, that was a community room, and that was built as part of the last major investment in the building, which was in 1992, where they added additional lifts and built the community room. So with the works we proposed, that there was not the need for that, so they went. And I think in the middle block there, you can see that's actually the proposed design for the ground floor. So our previous housing office was in that space, and by moving it into a new building that we'd constructed, we were able to get additional properties. So we had 2 3-bedroom accessible units there, and 2 1-bedroom flats, which were in addition to the existing properties. James. So these are just a couple of photos to show some of the sort of issues present with the building. So the first one on the left there, that shows the external walkways. That created significant issues in terms of trying to address heat loss. It's obviously a very complicated elevation, large surface area, and where you've got the sort of the blue concrete columns there, there's a reduced head height, so it wasn't really feasible to insulate those to the level required, to achieve a good standard, which then moved on to some of our issues over enclosing the walkways. Within the properties themselves, the middle picture there shows part of the living room. So the living rooms were quite large already. You can't really see it in the photo, but on the bottom left, that whole section is actually, there's a step up into that section, which it didn't really provide, much usable space to residents. There wasn't a lot they could do with it. And obviously, due to the issues over, the heating and the heat loss, a lot of residents actually closed off that section with thick curtains to try and retain the heat. Through that door leads you to a little balcony you can see on the right there. Again, it was a really poor space, very small, not really used for much, and it probably created more issues with things like pigeons, etc., than an actual, a nice usable space for residents. That was something that we tried to address as part of the scheme. James. Yeah. So I'll just go on to talk a bit about the resident engagement. If we could go to the next slide. So I think from our perspective, the resident engagement was a huge part of the scheme, and it is vital to the success of it. When I was first involved in the project, basically residents were obviously not happy at all, and their key wish really was to have new heating installed, and they wanted like a CHP or a communal heating system installed so they could heat their properties better. One of the challenges we had was trying to take them on the journey from doesn't really matter what heating you have, if you don't address the fabric, all that heat's going to be lost. So it took a lot of engagement and consultation to try and get them in the right place and sort of educate them over retrofit. So to do that, we changed our approach to what we've done previously. So we moved away from large scale sort of public meetings where you'd often have a couple of characters that would dominate the meeting, and we moved fully to one-on-one consultation. So we spoke to every single resident at length on numerous occasions to really understand, what was affecting them and what they sort of wanted from the project. And that initial graph there shows some of the key drivers. So obviously the key one was obviously improve the warmth of property, reducing the costs, of their fuel bills, and addressing sort of security and antisocial behaviour in the properties. If you move on. So some of these next few slides just show some of the results of the consultation. I think on this one, obviously the sort of pie charts there, they're pretty obvious in terms of what you'd expect in terms of the answers. But I think obviously the key things are the actual spoken feedback that we received. You can see the bills are too high, it's freezing in winter, damp and mold, the windows aren't effective, they can't get enough heat or hot water when they want it. So that was really key in driving where we went with the project. If you move on. Again, this second one, again a bit more resident consultation. I think the key one here is on the pie chart labeled number 4. That was about because of the design of the building, we had to enclose the communal walkways and also their balconies. So that really affected how they used the building and how they use their properties. Initially, there was a lot of people weren't happy with that they didn't want that to proceed. But it was vital to do that to try and make the best in terms of trying to retain the heat. So in terms of consultation, a key thing that we did was obviously to present proposals to them, take on board their feedback, and then we took on board their feedback, and we didn't just do a token effort of consultation. We actually looked at what can we do to try and address those. So one of the main problems was people use the external walkways to dry their clothes, etc. We managed to, by extending the existing property, we increased the size of their balconies, so they became an actual room, and from that we could use that as like a drying area, or they could use it as almost like a little conservatory to a degree. And also things like residents had vented tumble dryers that obviously from the proposed scheme they couldn't use going forward. So in those situations, we spoke to the individuals, worked out what they had, and we ended up replacing residents' tumble dryers for condensing ones, if they had that. And generally the cost of it was obviously minimal in the bigger picture. But I think, by taking on board some of their feedback, looking at what we could do to address it and then going back to them to show them what we'd done, we really started to build trust with them and also better engagement, because I think there's a lot of pessimism from them originally about, oh, we're not going to do anything. But I think, by actually demonstrating, we are listening to you and we are taking that on board, it really started to build relationships with residents and get them, to support the project. Move on. And again, similarly on this one, there was quite a bit of, pushback on. We made their living rooms bigger as part of the scheme, which obviously was a positive. But one of the key issues they weren't happy with was during the works they would lose a fair amount of their living rooms to allow us access to do the work. So again, to try and address that, we did a number of pilot properties at various stages throughout the project, where we could install measures, show them what it's like, during the works, show them what it's going to be like after the works. And with that, we put up petitioning systems in the lounge to divide off the lounge. We went around every property, we measured furniture, we talked to them about how they could rearrange their room, we provided off-site storage if necessary. And again, I think by sort of showing them the reality of the situation, it gradually brought them on board, to support the scheme. James. So alongside like the general consultation with residents, we also worked with the London School of Economics to do sort of a more in-depth resident study. So previously they'd done a pretty extensive survey on one of ECD's previous jobs, and they produced the document High Rise Hopes there. The one they did for Wilmcote House built on the findings, and they ended up publishing Retrofit to the rescue. I think that's available online, and I'm sure we can share a link to that if anyone wants to look at the details. If you move on to the next slide. The key thing with this consultation engagement was they basically identified a group of 15 residents, and properties, and we managed to do like in-depth interviews and consultations with the residents at all the way through the project. So the first round was prior to the work starting, so we could sort of ascertain their sort of support for the proposals and the work we're doing. The middle one was obviously during the works on site, and the final one was post completion. I think obviously the key points are initially they supported it. When it got on site, we had various issues, and there was things that went wrong and learning, and obviously I think that led to sort of fatigue, I think, from the residents in terms of being on a building site for so long. But it was interesting that despite the disruption, even when the works were on site, they still supported it and they still understood the principles of why we were doing the work. And then the final round obviously showed that residents were happy with what was done, and it had significantly improved their living conditions. If you move on. So again, just a couple of bits from the findings. Obviously, almost everyone who was consulted found that their flat was warmer, which sort of met one of the key objectives. And then the second figure there was about have your energy bills reduced, and obviously there's mixed results on that. And I think from our end there's a number of factors potentially influencing that. Firstly, obviously we all know energy bills have been increasing, so that contributes to a degree. And I think secondly, going back to that chart that I showed you earlier, was a lot of residents weren't even heating their properties sufficiently. So it wasn't a fact, they weren't getting the savings that they might have got if they had been. So again, it's something to consider, that retrofit schemes like this won't necessarily reduce the actual heating bill costs, but what they do is hopefully improve the living environment for the residents. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Adam. I'm not going to switch my camera on because I was having some internet problems, so hopefully you can hear me okay. But I'm just going to talk now a little bit about the EnerPHit standard and what that is and what that meant for the project. But one of the things that came out of the consultation, in fact, one of the key parts of the brief really from an early stage was the assumption on behalf of the residents and the council, and in fact in ourselves as well, that a key part of the solution would be to install an efficient heating system, because the residents were suffering with very inefficient storage heaters, and that certainly was part of the initial scope of works. But through the process of design and targeting this EnerPHit standard, we showed ultimately that that may not be necessary. So EnerPHit and Passive House, many of you be very familiar with this, so I won't dwell on this, but essentially there's 5 key aspects to that, but fabric first is perhaps the most important and widely known aspect, essentially super insulating the buildings, making sure that the heat loss through the fabric is absolutely minimized, improving the air tightness of the buildings, making sure that heat isn't lost through gaps and cracks, dealing with the thermal bridges, so the junctions where the wall meets the floor, all that complexity that Adam showed earlier on the walkways in particular, having mechanical ventilation with heat recovery is also key as well. And finally, having good quality components, so triple glazed windows. So those 5 aspects really are inherent to virtually all passive house projects and EnerPHit projects. So it's an international standard, and there's a lot of information on the internet, I'm sure, that you'll find if you look for it. Passive House Trust in the UK, as I say, is actually a really good place to look for information if you're not familiar with what they do. The slide here, I've not got many on Passive House and EnerPHit, but this is quite an interesting piece of research that Leeds Beckett University did a few years ago, looking at some Passive House buildings, comparing them with other low energy buildings, and showing that the area in white on those charts, that bar chart, is the predicted heat loss coefficient, or the energy consumption, if you like, of those properties. 30 odd properties. The ones circled on the right hand side are the passive house ones, and the black part of the bar is the extra over in the heat loss that beyond what was anticipated in the design. So this is regardless of how the building is actually used by residents. It's a test without residents in occupation of how the building really performs. And it shows really that the passive house buildings are designed to use less energy in the first place, and they also, the performance gap, which you may well be familiar with, is as a concept, is much less between measured performance and modeled performance. So there's much greater quality control, if you like, in the design and performance of buildings. This project was the UK case study for quite an interesting European program called EnerPHit, which was about looking at the challenges and the opportunities of future-proofing buildings to get to a net zero carbon outcome. And it was managed, EU funded, managed by the Passive House Institute, and we were the UK case study for that. And it wasn't about necessarily achieving EnerPHit in one go, but it was about getting there in a step-by-step process. And in the case of Wilmcote House, we were going 95% of the way to EnerPHit in one go, but some of the other projects around Europe were doing it in a more step-by-step way. So looking at the challenges and the benefits of the scheme, there are many challenges, and Adam's touched on some of them already. In terms of this being an LPS building, so structural implications of a large panel system building, and the potential fragility of that type of construction if it's not carefully managed. And one of the key things we had to do right at the outset was to understand the condition of the building, how it was designed, and what it was like. And so the work that our structural engineers did, Wilmcote House, was crucial at that early stage. Adam's mentioned already the community engagement. It was a challenge, but also a real benefit to the scheme, because we could work with the residents. But working with residents in situ, certainly in some parts of the building, was very difficult, very challenging. But there was never an intention to decant the building. The sheer cost of doing that and the lack of available properties to put residents in was just really a non-starter. So lots of technical challenges, as you would expect from working on a building of that scale. Supply chain issues was an issue, particularly with the impact on the UK construction industry, particularly the refurbishment sector, of government withdrawing funding on eco back in 2013-14. Chancellor's statement sort of pulled the rug from under the industry, and it had a massive impact on a lot of subcontractors. Upskilling the consultants and the contractor to achieve Passive House, understand Passive House and what the implications were. We were fortunate in being part of the EnerPHit project in that we got funding to support the training of the contractor team and the consultant team in that. And just the complexity of the building shape. So all of those issues added to additional cost. But the benefits, obviously, as Adam's touched on already, massive improvement in thermal comfort for residents, reduced energy bills to a certain extent for some residents, but for those who were not heating their home in the first place, maybe not so much. Obviously, fuel poverty is eradicated. Some CO2 reductions, but again, for those who were not heating their home, not essentially creating the carbon emissions, the gap is less, but still there was significant reduction. Rent arrears, again, improved, but not significantly so. Obviously, reduced maintenance costs. This was the most problematic building in Portsmouth City Council's portfolio for lots and lots of reasons, and it's really been transformed, as you can see from the images there. So the complexity shown there, that we're essentially taking the building out from the green dotted line to the orange dotted line as a single facade. We were insulating the main blocks A, B, and C. We were recladding the stair cores, but not insulating those, so essentially thermally decoupling them. We were showing there in section what that means in terms of extending the maisonettes. So each maisonette effectively got an extra 8 square meters, but then working in enclosing the walkways, that obviously meant impact on ventilation and fire. So the previously openable kitchen windows had to be fire rated and were not openable. So the ventilation was, all the other windows were openable, but that one couldn't be. So there was implications around that, managing the ventilation, the MVHR. The next few slides are really just a repeat of what I've been saying, but in terms of show you some snapshots of the building in construction. This is on the roadside elevation, so a very flat facade, but because of the LPS nature of the building, we couldn't drill into the existing concrete safely, and frankly, it would have required so many fixings that it would have made the lives of the residents intolerable, drilling so many holes into that concrete to fix the insulation. So we essentially fixed the frame at every party floor and party wall, and then insulated around that. So it was much quicker and much less disruptive to the residents. As I mentioned earlier, there was implications for the supply chain, subcontractors going bust during the course of the works, which obviously slowed things down. But nevertheless, we got there. This is an image showing the first block, block A. We were working in sequence. The original intention being we would finish one block completely before moving on. In the end, we decided to enable the contractor to work on multiple blocks at the same time. You can see some of the challenges there. That's the process of extending the living room out to meet the facade, the new facade. And what that means in terms of achieving EnerPHit is, in this case, well, every detail around the building envelope had to be reconsidered. So on the left-hand side there, you can see what we would have done under building regulations of the time, which was to take the insulation down to the DPC level, whereas with EnerPHit, we took it right down below ground levels, excavated and insulated that to prevent that thermal bridging that would have happened at ground. And because the block was occupied, we couldn't insulate the floor, so we effectively created a thermal skirt around the base of the building. That led to a cost difference, which we modeled at the time, showing where the extra over would be between building regulations scheme and the EnerPHit scheme that we were designing. So we identified a difference of about just over £1 million and showed where that breakdown was. So things like air tightness, MVHR, and extra insulation, very important parts of the equation. Actually, savings on mechanical ventilation, because we were effectively providing that with the MVHR. The existing building had a massive heat loss, so it had a heat loss of 188 kilowatt hours per square meter per year. The average house in the UK is about 140, so it's pretty poor. If we'd taken it to building regulations at the time, it would have taken us down to about 80, whereas we were targeting passive house, or actually EnerPHit, which was 25. So we were modeling all 3 blocks because the different orientations and with slightly different results, but ultimately showing that all 3 of them were below the 25 kilowatt-hour threshold. That resulted in a space heating saving to the residents collectively of £92,000 a year. If you then take off the running costs, the maintenance costs, you've got a net difference of about £82,000 overall, which in theory would result in a £745 saving, saving of £745 per year. But as I say, that was a theoretical one because many of the residents were not heating their homes properly in the first place. So looking at that, taking that saving, although of course the council were not benefiting from that saving, it was proving a positive NPV after 30 years if you could apply that saving to the capital cost difference. So just a few more images there showing CO2 reductions, obviously embodied carbon, massive savings there, which I'll come on to later. Huge benefits in terms of maintenance savings. And now just a few words about the monitoring. We are working and still working with Southampton University, who produced the original report showing the desperate fuel poverty in the building and produced the thermographic images you can see on the screen there, before and after, showing heat loss pretty much uncontrolled through that roadside elevation. And then on completion, you can see obviously a few residents have got their windows open, but generally speaking, the heat loss is massively reduced. This is an interesting slide from the research that they did, which was from an unheated flat, unoccupied flat actually, during what was called the Beast from the East. So it was -3 outside, and the internal temperature in this unheated, unoccupied flat, as you can see there, between a period from December to April 17 to 18, never went, or almost never went below 16 degrees, and generally above 18. So massive improvement on properties that previously were well below 12 and were being previously heated. I think it's fair to say that we always knew that the building would, if properly insulated using passive house methodology, there wouldn't be a risk of lack of heat in the winter or lack of comfort, but that we were concerned about the potential overheating risk. So we modeled that very carefully to ensure we had the right windows, that we weren't causing increased risk of overheating. And we also, with Southampton, put in monitoring on properties where there were residents using their windows and others where they were not using the windows, and to see the differences on that over several heating seasons. And this is a heat wave. This is one of the most extreme heat waves we've had in recent years. This is from June to July 2018, and you can see the external temperatures, which is the figures that are sort of zigzagging up and down, going above 30 degrees for many, many days. And you can see that CIBSE TM52 threshold is the green, the dark green bar there, but the internal temperatures were generally well below that, whether or not the residents were using their windows or not. Although since that period, we've discovered that in many ways you would want to encourage residents to open their windows at night to get benefit from night cooling. So very important, the aesthetics and perception of the building and how that was improved through the course of the design. This is the design, and then obviously this is completed, what the walkways now look like. But there was lots of other benefits as well in terms of health and well-being, and some of these things are mentioned in the LSE reports, Retrofit to the Rescue. So I'll skip on to talk about lessons learned. This is just some pictures showing the building completed. And really, I think if Adam wants to chip in as well on some of these, feel free, Adam. But in terms of working with the residents during construction, as I mentioned, it was a very challenging building, and and we provided very intensive consultation. And actually the facade replacement, the building of that new wall on the garden side elevation was very successful. We provided screens between the living rooms and the contractors doing the works, which provided safety to residents, but a view out of what was going on. But there were other issues in terms of top floor residents being impacted by the work. So that actually was something that we had to resolve during the project and arrange partial decant for that. So in terms of future projects, maybe if we were to do this again, partial or phase decant might be a sensible solution. And then finally, the impact on air tightness. So as I mentioned earlier, air tightness and measuring air tightness is a crucial part of any passive house or EnerPHit project. And because of the residents in occupation, and because of the delays to the project, at the end we were not able to complete the air tightness testing. So that's something that still hangs out in the project, which we'd like to go back and do at a later date. But so that was some of the issues with residents in construction. In terms of the impact of the works, I've mentioned some of these issues already. Fuel poverty has been eradicated in the building, and whilst there hasn't been a huge drop in fuel bills or carbon savings, it has obviously protected residents from rising fuel prices, which obviously is massively important at the moment and is likely to continue. Maintenance massively improved, and many residents don't need to heat their homes. The research that LSE and Southampton have shown has proved that many residents not heating their homes at all now, but not suffering as a consequence. Overheating risk is managed, but perhaps with climate change, we've modelled the scenario of the next 30 years and how rising temperatures might need to be managed in the building, and night cooling is something that is something we need to consider because a passive house building will have a much more stable range of temperatures. So if you can capture that cool night air in a building, then you can keep that in the property. So it potentially can perform a lot better than a standard building, even in a summer heat wave. And residents, interestingly, several residents moved in from blocks which were being decanted for other reasons into the building on completion, and they'd come from a communally heated building where there was very high temperatures, which the residents were not paying the true cost of the energy for. So residents were used to internal temperatures much higher than the residents of Wilmcote House, and because of that, they were reporting the Wilmcote temperatures to be a little bit low compared to the existing residents. So it is very important. Resident perception is very important, and what the starting points are. In terms of Portsmouth City Council, Adam, if you want to speak to this slide.
Yeah. So I think like from our end going forward, I think it has influenced where we're going to go. I think with our future maintenance, and I think we're currently working on a number of completely other end of the scale, smaller retrofit schemes, where we're looking to try and apply it to sort of low rise, sort of 1950s, 60s blocks of flats. And I think that's really with a view of we've got 15,000 properties, 1,000 blocks. We want to try and develop a model for retrofitting at scale. And sort of appreciating that not every building is going to be as difficult and as complicated as Wilmcote. So hopefully, that was something to move forward with. And also from a new build perspective, we are looking to try and move fully to doing passive house new builds. One aspect, we had a full-time clerk of works on the job, and I can't stress enough how useful I think that was for everyone in terms of assisting and also ensuring quality control. I think as a client, one thing definitely to say about retrofitting and also to the EnerPHit standard is it drove quality of the works on site. And just a quick example of something that I found it got me was if you do a typical window replacement job, there's always like endless spray foam around around the reveals, trying to make it fit, etc. Every single window that was put in on the building was installed correctly. There was, airtight membranes installed, smoke testing done. So really trying to drive to that standard drove the quality as well, which I think was, vital. Going back to one of my original points was, I think, it proved that, if you invest in the fabric of the building, it almost doesn't matter what the heating is. And I think, from our end, we've invested in the fabric. That's a much longer term solution than having to put a heating system in that's going to have to be maintained, replaced at some point. And also, it's quite a simple approach. There's not complicated, things for residents to learn or control. They basically just live in the properties, and the fabric does the work really. I think the monitoring, and engagement of the residents was really important. We're just about to go back and do further consultation with all the residents again on a one-on-one basis to get some further detail about, having lived there for a couple of years, how do you find it? And I think, that engagement as a whole really, put credit in the bank, I think, in terms of trust, so that, where we did come across challenges, during the works, that they trusted us and they sort of believed, that actually a bit of disruption in the short term is a benefit longer term.
Okay, I'm just going to say then just a final few slides in terms of the future of retrofit, because obviously a lot has changed in the world since we first got involved in Wilmcote back in 2012, and certainly since and even since it's completed actually. In the last 3 years, obviously the government's net zero target, actually that's the Scottish one, 2045, but it should be 2050 in the UK. And to do that, obviously we need to reduce our carbon emissions, we reduce our demand, do all the things that Wilmcote is doing. We need to consider avoiding unnecessary and wasteful demolition, which is carbon intensive, and find ways of getting low carbon heating. So whether that's heat pumps or other low carbon sources. And the future is electric, but it has to be obviously sourced from the right sources, the right renewable sources, and most efficient methods of heating homes. This is a slide from an ongoing scheme that we're currently doing for others, for a tower block retrofit scheme, which just shows the importance of whole life carbon, because really everything we've been talking about today is about operational carbon, reducing the energy consumed during the operation of the building, the heating, the hot water, all of that. But it's also vitally important that we don't waste embodied carbon. We don't demolish our buildings unnecessarily. And sometimes we have to, maybe, but there may be structural reasons or other reasons. But this slide, which is a study done by Sheffield University for us on another scheme, shows the difference between the 3 retrofit scenarios that we considered for that building and the demolition and new build alternative of a block exactly the same size. And you can see that the embodied carbon is between 4 and 8 times more than the retrofit options for the new build. So if we're looking at a whole life carbon, we really can't ignore embodied carbon, and we need to consider a circular economy as part of that. So the other thing that's come out in the last couple of years is the new standard PAS 2035, 2019, and this came out of the Green Deal and the failures of the Green Deal, the Bonfield review that was published a few years ago, and it really tries to capture how to improve quality in retrofit, and it's really well worth reading. There's lots of really good publications there by Retrofit Academy, so I won't really dwell on that, but if you're not familiar with that, you really should try and you are involved in the retrofit sector or want to be, then you really should try and get hold of those copies. They are all available online. But it introduces several new roles. Some of them are very familiar, so obviously the retrofit installer, you can see on the left hand side there is the contractor, but that is a properly accredited contractor. The designer, this can be the architect and or the engineers, again properly experienced in retrofit. But there's a few new roles there: assessors, the person who essentially models the building to understand how it's really performing in existing, and then the coordinator is the person who essentially project manages the process through from start to finish and identifies all the risks and ensures that they're properly managed and works with the designer and then the installer to make sure that they're delivered in construction. And then the evaluator at the end of the process, it's a bit like really what we've been doing with Southampton and LSE really on Wilmcote, is how does the building really perform? Too many buildings don't have that handover or that extended handover. We don't know how they perform, but with this project we really did, and that we hope will become the norm through past 2035. And then finally, the future of retrofit, I think, there's a lot at stake at the moment, and there's a lot of questions the government needs to answer, really, which we wish we knew the answers to ourselves, but maybe we can pick that up in the questions at the end. So that's really it from me. I think I need to stop sharing. Hopefully that's that button there.
Right, thank you very much, Adam and James. That was a really useful run through of what was clearly a very interesting and challenging project. We've got a few minutes for some questions, and indeed we've had 1 or 2 questions from the audience that I'm sure we can try and get through those now, I think. Just taking the first one, which is from Dylan Dixon. It's, did the contractors already have the necessary skill or experience to work to the standards required?
Shall I start on that one? So there was, when the project was tendered back in 2014, there was very, very few contractors, if any, of the major contractors at that time that had any experience of Passive House or EnerPHit. As I say, we secured funding for the contractor to for their tradespeople to undertake a Passive House awareness course, the fundamentals of what the implications are in terms of delivering that on site. We were very prescriptive in terms of our tender documents, and also we encourage the contractors to partner with designers and others who could support them, because a significant part of the work was a contractor design portion. So they partnered with consultants who were able to sort of guide them through the process, really, and that actually worked very well. So we were retained on the client side as providing that scrutiny, but they had a team of their own that they could draw on to enable them to resolve issues.
Okay, we've had another question in, which is about vacuum heating. So Robert Fitzpatrick asks, have you thought about vacuum heating instead of triple glazing? It's lower as in weight, gives you a lower U value, and doesn't use inert gases. It also has a lower guarantee in relation to unit integrity.
Sorry, I missed some of that. Could you repeat that? Sorry, Carl.
Yes, yes, it is quite a long question. It's, have you thought about vacuum heating instead of triple glazing? Is the short. Yes.
We've used, I think vacuum glazing we've used on properties where there's conservation issues, but I mean, maybe the technology has moved on. This is obviously this was designed in 2014. I don't know about the latest performance available from vacuum glazing, but certainly we've used it where there's conservation issues and we can't change from single glazing. So sorry, I wouldn't be able to comment any further on that one.
Okay, fair enough. Another question from the audience. Is there a BBA certificate for the below DBC and or warranty?
Is there a BBA certificate for the installation used below the DPC? Is that what it was saying?
I think so, yeah. I think that's what it's saying.
Good question. We used an XPS installation. That was the only area that was not rock wool. So that was the bit below ground. Yeah, I don't know. We'd have to look into that. I suspect, I'm sure there was, because that's some a normal requirement for any project when we do the material research. But it's obviously 6 years ago when we were doing that. So yeah, I think the answer is probably yes, but I don't know.
Okay. You touched on this. This is a question from me. You touched on this a little bit towards the end, but what support would you want to see from the government in the heat and buildings strategy, for instance, to enable these kind of projects to be brought forward more easily?
I suppose, I don't know, Adam, do you want to answer some of that, or shall I?
Well, I think just probably not so much on that, but I think one of the frustrations that we found, sorry, in terms of the project, and particularly around funding, and this is an ongoing issue, is whatever funding is available, that there's always the timescales are not realistic in terms of getting the funding and spending it. And you look at this project. I was first involved in 2010 in it. We got completion in 2019. We looked at funding options, and in the end, we basically took the view that we'll just self-fund it, because there was the timescales weren't realistic. The sort of hoops you had to jump through to get it, again, weren't realistic. So I think from our perspective, it needs to be a longer term offering. If there is funding available for it. I think James probably can talk more about the specific details.
Yeah, I suppose really it follows on from what Adam was saying. I suppose clarity. The heat and building strategy has taken so long, and we still don't know what it looks like. But what I would want is a real focus on the fabric. I think if I was, what I really wouldn't want to see is a focus on, say, hydrogen as part of the solution, because for dwellings, for flats, even larger blocks like this, we don't think it's a sensible outcome. But I think it has to start with a fabric, and your heating system services should be a secondary consideration.
Okay, we're almost out of time, but I just wondered before we go whether I could get each of you really just to give us one kind of key takeaway. We could boil it down into the most important thing from the session today. What would be? Who wants to go first with that one?
I can if you want.
Yep.
I think from our end, it was a couple of things, but I'll try and be brief. It's purely about future-proofing the buildings, really. And we could have done a scheme, to current building regs that would have made a bit of a difference. But the key takeaway that we learned was, we want our buildings to be good quality, and provide a good living environment for our residents in 20, 30 years' time. And I think by going to the extent with the refurbs that we did, then you look at everything that's happening today in the last few weeks. We've been proactive in addressing that, and it's having less of an impact than it would do for our wider residents. So I think definitely, it's got to be, you've got to look at the long term and also look at the whole life cycle of the building, and not just a short-term solution. You do the fabric, you're doing the core elements that are going to last for a lot longer than pure heating schemes may do.
Okay, so it's about thinking long term and thinking about the fabric. James, what would your key takeaway be? You had to have one.
I can't really add very much to what Adam said there. Really, it's about long-term thinking and focus on the fabric. Really, keep it simple. Really.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much to Adam and James, and to our sponsors, Rockwool. This session will be available to rewatch on demand, but for now, thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.